All right, I would like to welcome on stage Paolo Ardoino, Phil Zimmermann, and Adam Back. Okay. All right. Full house here. We did a panel very similar to this one last year, and it was, we had the great Nick Szabo here. Now we have the great Phil Zimmermann here. I'm so excited to talk about PGP and all of the various things related to it. So let's just get straight into the topic. So Phil, you created this wonderful tool called PGP. Can you tell us the origin story about PGP?
Well, I wanted to develop PGP back in the 80s, but I was very busy as a peace activist at the time and just didn't have time to work on it. So I had to wait until later on, and I had just learned how to do math with 1000-bit integers, and so that was kind of the trickiest building block for doing public key cryptography. And I thought that I knew how to do cryptography. I even developed my own block cipher, which is a pretty stupid idea. And so the first version of PGP was not very good cryptographically, for the block cipher mainly. And it was kind of rushed because it, like so many young engineers, engineers are pathological optimists when it comes to predicting how long it's going to take to get anything done. And so I severely underestimated. Everything is estimated to take 3 months, and I missed 5 mortgage payments. And so I had to get it out the door or else I'd lose my house. So I had to leave out the trust model in the first version. But then the second version was 15 months later, and the cryptography got a lot better. And we had the trust model implemented. And a guy who helped me a lot on the trust model was Hal Finney. I had wanted to do the trust model in the first version. I had it in my mind how it was going to work, but I just ran out of time. And so Hal Finney rolled up his sleeves and volunteered to crank out the code to do this, and he added even some improvements of his own, and it turned out to be a good distributed trust model. I like my natural design instincts are to go for a decentralized distributed trust model because you create the conditions for emergent behavior. Emergence is the idea of building complexity from low-level rules, and that made it more resilient against the central top-down model, which has a single point of failure.
Wow. So you created PGP 1.0, it didn't have a trust model, you got some collaborators, you got to PGP 2.0. So Adam, I know you saw PGP fairly early on. What's your first touch point with PGP, and how did it sort of affect the rest of your life?
Actually PGP was what led me to find the Cypherpunks list, so it was like quite a big thing for me. And I had a friend at university who was a master's student implementing RSA on parallel computers to make it faster, because CPUs were a bit slower then. And so I knew what RSA was. And then, of course, all over the technology news was PGP when it was first released. And I thought it was fascinating, the kind of combination of mathematics, programming, and sort of self-sovereignty, changing the balance of power between the individual and the overbearing state. So I thought it was super interesting, and try to find a forum where presumably there would be people talking about similar things, and that was where I found the Cypherpunks, because that's exactly what they were talking about. PGP, things you could do with PGP, like Hal Finney made a remailer using PGP to improve the privacy, and they were also talking about things like Tor before Tor existed, and electronic cache. That was like a really the holy grail for the Cypherpunks.
And Paolo, you are affected. You're sort of the next generation here, but how are you affected by PGP, and what was your first sort of encounter with it?
Yeah, I remember the first time I saw PGP, for me, was a revelation. In a way, was the first consumer product that was bringing privacy, the ability to, the right to privacy for people, right? So on the internet. Before you could only use symmetric encryption. Of course, you had already RSA, but no one implemented a sort of retail solution for RSA and for asymmetric encryption. And so when I saw that, it's actually, I told Phil just a few minutes ago when I met him that his work shaped my career, right? So I'm always been kind of a, not hothead, but activist myself. I love to understand how things were built and break things as well. And it all started with how I can protect myself. Protection is coming. It means also how you can protect yourself, but your families, your dears, your friends, and having tools that started like PGP it was unbelievable. It was a time when internet was basically not a thing yet, right? And you had already great people building these tools that are resisting to the test of time.
And how old were you when all of this happened?
I was 14, around, something like that.
Right, so it was fairly early that it sort of shaped the formative years of your life with this technology. But to move on with the story, so you created this thing, and then the U.S. government comes after you. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened with sort of the attack surface that you were exposed to as a result of being the creator of PGP?
Yeah, I got a call from U.S. Customs. They wanted to ask me questions about PGP, and I thought that maybe they just had run into PGP in their law enforcement activities and needed some advice about what to do. So I was explaining on the phone about how it works and all this stuff. And then they asked me if they could come and interview me. Well, they were in San Jose, California. I was in Boulder, Colorado. That means somebody would have to fly on an airplane to come and talk to me face to face. And that's when I started to suspect that there was something more going on here than just a desire for a tutorial. And so I had to hire a criminal defense lawyer, and we agreed to do an interview in his office. And it became clear that, they were after me. And so then I got some more volunteers, lawyers, and built up a pretty good legal defense team. We didn't get notified that I was officially a target until a couple months later. But once I knew that I was a target of an investigation, then we had to ramp up our legal defense team. We got a really good team. We got Eben Moglin, who some of you may recognize, wrote the GPL version 3. He was a Columbia Law School professor. He clerked for Thurgood Marshall, and before he became a lawyer, he wrote an APL interpreter. APL is an old, ancient language that you have to be pretty smart to implement that. And then we had Ken Bass, who was formerly of the Jimmy Carter Justice Department, working on national security stuff. We had Kurt Carnow, who was an intellectual property lawyer, but was a former federal prosecutor. And then we had Phil Dubois, my lead defense counsel, who was a streetwise criminal defense lawyer who knew his way around the courtroom. And so that was the core legal team. Then we had a couple of other contributors to it who provided some amicus briefs and so on. It looks like it was going to be a First Amendment issue.
Well, we talked a little bit before this panel, and one of the things that struck me was you said you were able to sort of like prevail, and obviously all of these defense lawyers are very expensive and so on, in part because you had the moral high ground here, and it was clear that what you were
they volunteered. Most of them volunteered. Mm-hmm. They worked for large law firms which had a pro bono department. Pro bono apparatus, and the only guy that we had to pay was the lead counsel because he was a sole practitioner.
And that led to how many years of legal wrangling before?
Well, it went on for 3 years. And, you know, I knew I was guilty. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew that I was guilty. And you know, we went to Washington. I had to go to Washington to testify in front of a House committee on some legislation. They were trying to get rid of the export controls for cryptography. And while I was there, I went to the offices of, I think it was maybe EFF had an office there. And so we had lawyers from EFF, CPSR, Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, and a Washington law firm, and ACLU, and I don't know. We had like 10 lawyers in the room. And so we closed the door, and so it's all lawyers except for me. And they wanted me to explain to them what I'd done. So I explained to them what I'd done, and they all said, "Oh shit, you're going to prison." The only guy who didn't say that was my lead defense counsel, because he was a creature of the courtroom, and he knew that he could fight in the courtroom and probably get some traction at least.
Well, so we have this sort of like trial for the creator of PGP. So Adam, I want to ask you, like, did this affect, you think, Satoshi Nakamoto's decision to be anonymous? Like this very, you know, large burden that Phil had to carry with PGP. Did that affect Satoshi Nakamoto, you think?
I mean, we don't know, but it looks likely that, you know, anybody who was paying attention and saw that event would realize that releasing software can expose you to regulatory risks, and that maybe bearer electronic cache would be even less popular with regulators than encrypted emails. And there was another sort of case about electronic cache, which was the e-gold system, and the founders of that also had significant legal troubles. It was actually fairly popular. You know, there were millions of users and so on. It was transacting. You could transact with grams of gold, and they held it in a warehouse. But I don't know the full details of the legal complaint, but evidently they considered that to be some form of money transmission with insufficient regulatory coverage or something. So, you know, if for anybody who was building cryptographic software, it's something to think about. And actually, there was a couple of pieces of software on the Cypherpunks list that were published by pseudonyms, even though they weren't, you know, they're kind of more prototypes and didn't actually get widespread use. One of them was called Magic Money by Product Cipher, and it was a kind of Chore mint, but with no way to move value in and out. And there was a couple of other pieces. So, and there were people on the Cypherpunks list using, you know, the anonymous remailers. So the first of which, Hal Finney implemented using Phil Zimmermann's PGP, and so they were quite interested in privacy, just, you know, for the heck of it, right? You should demonstrate you could have it to benefit from it. So there's a bit of a culture of pseudonymity, privacy, and anonymous publishing. But I think there were object lessons drawn from, you know, the indictment Phil Zimmermann was under for some years there, and the legal troubles that eGold had.
Well, so thinking back on sort of like the legal and regulatory attack on PGP, how much do you guys think it set it back, right? Because in a sense, I think we all know that like PGP is more or less used by people like us on stage, not necessarily by the, you know, grandma that's using email or something like that. How much of the regulatory attack prevented its adoption going forward?
I mean, I think it didn't necessarily hurt much, but Phil may have some opinions because he incorporated a company, PGP Incorporated, which is a venture-funded company after this event, and proceeded to commercialize that. But at least with PGP, there was an initiative to build an open source international version, because there were, you know, for a period of time, export rules from the US, but no import rules. And so, you know, the Europeans figured, well, they could, you know, fill in the missing pieces. And so I think that was one of the arguments used to persuade the US to eventually relax these rules, which is it's pushing US jobs in the cryptographic industry overseas who could sell secure products, whereas the US counterparts couldn't export them out, couldn't sell out of the US, basically.
I think the biggest thing that held PGP back was the cognitive burden of the trust model. I really like the decentralized trust model. It's also part of the appeal of why, I mean, Bitcoin is a decentralized architecture also, and there's a lot of appeal to decentralized architectures. But PGP's decentralized architecture imposed a cognitive burden on the user. I've seen examples of top-down centralized trust models. I was working with a company in the Netherlands that did X509, smart cards, firmware for smart cards for government users, government agencies, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Health. These are monolithic organizations that are, institutionally the same architecture, top-down architecture as the trust model that they used. And it was perfect fit. I mean, that kind of trust model works very well in a monolithic agency. But it doesn't work so well in a distributed, society-wide, mutually, competitive entities that are just out there in society. And so PGP was well suited for that, but it also imposed a cognitive burden on the user that was not there for some hospital worker in the Ministry of Health that was holding a smart card that opened doors for them or prescribed drugs or whatever. And that cognitive burden, I think, held PGP back. There was a paper published many years ago called Why Johnny Can't Encrypt. And some part of that paper was about the cognitive burden of the trust model. Now, SMIME also had some cognitive burdens, except it was more on the IT department, because it was very high activation energy to set up a SMIME, because you had to build an entire PKI to make it work. PGP, you didn't have to do that, but you had to understand, in the PGP manual it said PGP is for people who like to pack their own parachutes. The problem is your mom doesn't know how to pack parachutes. And so your mom is not going to use PGP. So that's what I think held back PGP the most.
Paolo, you were involved in trying to sort of share knowledge of PGP in the Italian community. What was your experience trying to get people to adopt it?
Yeah, so for a few years I participated to, when I was a kid, there were these hacker magazines I was a big fan of Frack, that is a well-known international hacking magazine. But then, I started to collaborate with a few of them on the Italian scene. And I tried to explain how RSA was working and the concepts behind RSA, how, why it was sophisticated, why it was resilient, why it was solid, and also showcase how you could build your software, build in RSA in your software, and build your homemade PGP. I think was a simple way from a kid to explain to friends how they could build their own privacy tools. They could protect themselves. They could go around and explain how it works to their friends. I was kind of naive because of course no one would go around and parties explaining how RSA works. But nevertheless was a really intriguing path for me to try to get also to the bottom of it. I wrote a couple of papers on how you could try to factorize big numbers to explain the different techniques and showcase why inherently RSA was solid and why this guy chose to use that within PGP.
Well, so we saw with PGP that it didn't have that much uptake. And instead, I think what ended up happening is people started using email for their communications and stuff like that. That's still, to a large degree, the standard today. And of course, email is horribly insecure, and there are many paths for any authority to come in and get it. I think Jameson Locke gave a presentation here last year about how difficult email can be and how we kind of lost. how do we? What are some like if you're to look back on email and sort of the way that it won, what are some lessons that we can take away about the regulatory state, the user behavior, centralization? How can we make sure that that doesn't happen in a lot of the other technologies that are coming forward?
I mean, I think potentially the analogy for Bitcoin is to take seriously the risks of centralization, because there was a time, a number of people ran their own mail server, and it just got more and more difficult to keep it running, to keep it well connected. And running a Bitcoin full node today, or like a Bitcoin core wallet, is super easy in comparison, and doesn't use a crazy amount of resources. So an average user can typically do that on a laptop or some small computing device. And people without any respect for or understanding of the previous sort of centralization failures don't appreciate that where people are coming from when they're saying, no, decentralization is important, because we've seen centralized systems have nasty side effects. And, of course, many of the email infrastructures are now big public companies with cloud-hosted infrastructure. And, the NSA, as Snowden has revealed, were crawling around the inside, hoovering all the data, or, explicitly authorized to, right, by the company. And so, we have to keep those things in mind in avoiding the mistakes of that. And I think another thing that Phil mentioned, the web of trust, which is the decentralized trust model that PGP has. And another kind of failure was the certificate authority model, which is a centralized model used by, or hierarchical model used by all secure websites, by SMIME, which is an encrypted email option. And those are, because they're hierarchical, any one of those trust anchors can be, backdoored or coerced, and in fact, the intelligence communities actually run a few of them. So they can impersonate anybody in the entire system, as well as get cooperation from big telecoms companies and big mail providers and things like that. So I think it highlights the need for end-to-end security and to preserve decentralization to keep the original properties working.
I think that email has an enormous attack surface, and I would be reluctant today to try to send sensitive information through email. I still do it sometimes, but I do it with the help of extra protocols to try to harden it a bit. If I'm really trying to protect stuff that I'm transmitting, I use a different protocol. I use Signal. Or I use my own app, Silent Phone, from Silent Circle, which is kind of like Signal. And the attack surface is much smaller, and that's good. It's also, it's got forward secrecy, which it's nearly impossible to achieve with email. In fact, people don't want forward secrecy in email because they want to go back and read their old emails from years ago. In fact, they even use it in litigation and discovery, And so, if you can't really apply forward secrecy to email effectively, there's too much market resistance to that. And so I would rather just abandon email, as just being too, if your key is compromised, if your private key is compromised, the blast radius can be infinite. You have all the past stuff is exposed. And if you're unaware that the key was compromised, then it goes into the future as well. If you use a protocol like the Signal protocol, you don't have that kind of exposure. The compromise is very restricted as to how far the damage can reach. So, I don't think, I have to use email sometimes there's certain official kinds of communications that require it, but I just try not to use it for anything really sensitive.
Yeah, I think my opinion that email resisted till today also for incentives. I think that Adam kind of touched base on that. So there are incentives to not change a technology that is a massive honeypot for in terms of privacy and security, right? So, is a way there are incentives from big tech firms to run these gigantic mail servers that everyone uses, like Gmail or like a Yahoo Mail and so on, that and are a great way to collect people's information. So also, I think, again, Jameson last year explained how it's impossible today to run your mail server because just your mail will not go anywhere, will not reach anyone. And it's all, in my opinion, I don't want to be this tinfoil hat guy, but at the same time, I feel like there are no incentives to change a technology that is, is in one side, is an honeypot for information, for, I don't know, any parties that might want to access that information, and also is a milking cow for big tech firms that can access to the data and get fresh information about everyday routines of people.
Yeah, there's a lot of pessimism around email, I guess, and there is a lot of centralization that just sort of creeped in over time, and an attack surface that increased as more features were added and so on. And it's an unfortunate situation, but we're kind of stuck with it almost at this point. I want to shift gears a bit and talk about sort of the consequences for Bitcoin, because obviously we're still early, as we say. What are some steps or what are some lessons that we can carry forward to Bitcoin? What are some things that we can do? And how does that reflect in the ethics that we have in this community? And how can we make sure that it doesn't fall prey to some of these sort of regulatory attacks and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the so-called block size wars of some years ago sort of caused people to be a bit more aware that running your own node was actually also important in addition to controlling your own keys. And of course, Lightning adoption, it uses nodes, so there's a lot of people that started running nodes for Lightning reasons. But I think, you don't need everybody to run a node, but I think it's important that, a reasonable proportion of, power users or hobbyists or people who are interested to take a bit more sovereignty and take part in the security of the network. I mean, in PGP terms, it's a bit like, there were some people who took more seriously building up their web of trust. And so they'd meet somebody at a conference and they'd religiously add them and they'd have a huge web of trust. And other people would have one connection. But, the combination is still good because the people who took that seriously, provided routing of trust between the other people. So it's sort of similar with Bitcoin, right? That, if some people are using full nodes, they're verifying the transactions, they're part of the transaction network. So, and I think it's a bit of use it or lose it mentality. So, back in the Cypherpunk days, I was already a little worried that governments would try to phase out cash, move people to debit cards or online things, right? And so I was, resolved to use cash everywhere they would accept cash because, in a society that is much more heavy user of cash, and I think Switzerland is a quite heavy user of cash compared to other developed countries, it's very hard for the government to get the initiative to say, well, we want to ban cash, because now you have, 90% of the population saying, that's crazy, I use it every day, right? And so I think the idea that you would use the technology, and there are lots of people using the full nodes and expecting to, then if, some company tries to centralize and erode that, you have an outcry. Whereas if everybody gets relaxed and, you could do that, but nobody does it, then it's very easy for the system to shift.
Well, from my point of view, I think I go back again on the concept of centralization, right? So we are seeing one of the learnings that we have to at least put a good use is the fact that we should not allow Bitcoin mining to be centralized in a single country. You talk about regulations. I mean, imagine we all remember that more than 50% of Bitcoin mining was done in China until 2019. Then China banned Bitcoin mining, and the majority of Bitcoin mining moved to the US now. I mean, Texas has crazy low prices for electricity, but there is, of course, there are pros on the internet, on the electricity grid of Texas, but at the same time, it could be, regulatory pressure, political pressure, or just something goes wrong, or someone pushed the wrong button, and the entire energy grid of a state in the U.S. will go down. So I think that as part of, I think the Bitcoin movement, we should push towards more geopolitical diversity when it comes to Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, and I think is a risk that at least we have to be aware of. So we try always to support companies that start mining farms around the world in different continents and different states, because also again regulations, politicians might like it or not. And so they could decide to shut it down or not. So imagine how if 50% of the hash rates suddenly or like whatever is in Texas could be 20% will suddenly go down. So block time will go a little bit up. Then we have to wait for the adjustment and so on. But if it's 50% or 70%, that is an enormous concentration. And so that's, I think, one of the, let's say, biggest stress that we have now.
Phil, from your perspective, what sort of advice would you have for our community, the people that are in Bitcoin? Given what you've gone through and the experience that you have, how would you advise us, I guess, in protocol development and many other things?
Well, Bitcoin's protocol has already been nailed down, but sometimes I wish we could have a protocol that had some more features that I'm not sure how to implement those features. But I would like to see, I lived for 5 years in the Netherlands, and they used ATM cards to purchase things. So if you buy a candy bar, you pay with your PIN card. It's almost entirely cashless. But I've seen other countries where everything is cash. I find it appealing to be able to make anonymous purchases. I want to be able to go into a bookstore and buy a book, and nobody knows I bought that book. But Bitcoin is not completely anonymous. It has some well-known, it's got pseudonymity. It's pseudonymitous.
Pseudonymous.
Yes, right. So in some sense, I find it more interesting to have something like Zcash or Monero. But on the other hand, I don't want to see Vladimir Putin sidestepping sanctions with, vast anonymous transfers of, billions of dollars. I want a pony, I want a unicorn. I want a protocol that somehow makes it harder to do money laundering and sanction evading at the large scale. But I also want individuals to be able to walk into a bookstore and buy a book and not have anyone know who they are.
Do you guys think that's
I don't know
possible?
how to achieve all those objectives. These things seem to be pulling in different directions. Oh, and while you're at it, let's just reduce the carbon footprint. So, proof of work is the only thing that we can have a lot of confidence about. I'm interested in observing what happens with the new Ethereum proof of stake approach. I'm going to watch carefully over the next couple of years and see if that fares well. And if it does, that's nice. But I'm not completely confident about it. But we have to use less electricity than the country of Argentina to do Bitcoin mining.
Do you guys think it's possible to kind of have our cake and eat it too? What do you think?
Well, I think if you want a currency that is for everyone and is unstoppable, that resists to the wrath of God, it's not possible to make it another way apart, what Bitcoin is today. And when it comes to proof of work, you rightfully said it, is like the only thing that we can trust. I'm not a big believer in other approaches just because they pose enormous risks of concentration and also attack from potential regulators. We have seen in the US how Bitcoin has always been considered a commodity, so never under attack for its being considered or used as a currency, while Ethereum, there is unnamed yet, at least, or there is still in a limbo because of also the change of proof of stake. So there are in my opinion, there are ways to reduce the carbon footprint. That is, invest in renewable energy. That is what many companies Bitcoin are doing. Bitcoin miners are the first ones that have the incentive to take part of the profits and invest in renewable energy. We are doing it. I know that many friends in the industry are doing it, and maybe just because we want to have Elon Musk setting Bitcoin payments for Tesla if the carbon footprint goes below 50%. But still, I think is the only we have to push back on the concept that proof of work is actually the thing that is polluting the world, because it's the least of our problems, and it's actually a good push to reinvest more in hydro, solar, even potentially nuclear, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it comes down to is it's kind of like physical gold versus fiat currency. That if for money to be a hard money, I come to the view that it basically has to have an unavoidable production cost. Because if there's no unavoidable production cost, then there are groups of humans who will lobby to change the amount of it, to change the emission, to reassign it, and so on. And you see these kinds of things, actually happening. With the changing the policy. It's sort of like almost like a central bank in a altcoin, right? And then I think, beyond using the renewable and, as Paolo said, building it, I think Bitcoin can actually, because governments often talk about wishes. Like Phil said, we all want a pony, right? So the question is, the politicians will vie for the things we wish for, but in the real world, somebody has to finance it and build it. And for that to happen in industry, there has to be a profit motive, for somebody to make a case for the project financing. And Bitcoin is interesting for that because energy demands are very variable, and Bitcoin can use any unused energy. So it makes it easier to sort of finance the construction of more power. And so I find it hopeful that Bitcoin could actually finance the expansion of power, and I think the capacity, the availability of power is very strongly correlated with the wealth of nations over hundreds of years actually. So maybe we'll get there via Bitcoin funding it.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing that we talked about a little earlier, Phil, about how when you were put under indictment with PGP, that the reason why you had so many lawyers volunteering pro bono to defend you was because you had the moral high ground. It was clear that what you were doing was the right thing. And at least from my perspective, when I think about somebody like Vladimir Putin using it, or various, I guess, unsavory characters that are using it for their purposes, what we've seen in this community is that they eventually come to justice. We saw, for example, with somebody like Sam Bankman-Fried, who perpetuated this fraud. They try to do evil things with it. There are enough people within sort of like that circle that are willing to.
Yeah, I'm not sure we would have caught up with Bankman-Fried if he had thousands of nuclear weapons.
Well, the point being that there is sort of like a moral dimension to this that I think naturally protects us, and we don't necessarily need a centralized authority or somebody to.
I think basically the point is that a currency shouldn't have a legal layer, right? So a currency is a currency. It should be used by everyone and should be available to everyone indistinguishably from who you are. And there is a legal framework in the world, in society, that should be enforced and is enforced to catch bad guys.
Yeah. All right, so we have like 50 seconds here, and it's counting down very quickly. But what are some hopes for you going forward with respect to private communication, the cypherpunk culture, and so on? Very quickly. 10 seconds for each person.
Well, I think like end-to-end security is key. So I'd like to see more end-to-end secure and peer-to-peer applications.
Yeah, end-to-end security, end-to-end encryption should be ubiquitous. It has grown quite a bit, but in the last couple of years, we've seen some pushback from several democracies, notably the Five Eyes, and so we have to push back against that. We've enjoyed 20 years of strong cryptography. It's too late to try to roll it back, and so we have to fight for the preservation of what we already have.
Yeah, I was reading that UK doesn't want to have or wants to ban encryption in WhatsApp, and France is kind of against encryption as well, and so on. I mean, I think that the train already left the station, but these are good reminders that we shouldn't sit back and relax, because
that's right.
Yeah, we have the threat to the to our right of privacy is always there.
What they're targeting in the UK and Australia and other democracies is that they're focusing on end-to-end encryption. They don't care about TLS connections to your bank or Amazon. They care about end-to-end encryption. PGP is end-to-end encryption. The Signal protocol is end-to-end encryption, which of course is used in WhatsApp. That's what they care about. That's what they're pushing against.
They want the ability to snoop. All right. So thank you so much. Let's give these guys a round of applause. So we have a... We have a little bit of a surprise here, and we are going to honor the cypherpunk spirit that we just talked about for the last 40 minutes. I would like to invite on stage Stella Assange and the artist Oscar Stocker. If you guys could come up to the stage, we have a little bit of a video. Fred Nuremberger and Otto Tasnadi as well. Please come up on stage and join us while we watch this tribute video. And you guys can turn around, I guess, or I think it might be on this thing as well. So we'll get to watch the tribute video that they've put together to honor the cypherpunks.
In a world just before the birth of the networked age, struggling with a vague notion of Orwellian surveillance and loss of personal freedom that appeared more like dystopian fiction, cryptography was deemed a forbidden weapon. At this very moment, a group of visionaries emerged, the cypherpunks.
What is this cypherpunk? What do you guys stand for? Cypherpunks are cryptography activists. We believe in personal privacy for everybody.
They believed in cryptography as the shield for individual rights, privacy, the power to choose. A call for a future, safeguarded by cryptography. Their influence echoes today. A brighter future is possible. In this digital era, what will you do to guard your privacy and freedom? Together, we sculpt a future where rights find refuge and voices resound. We honor the cypherpunks, valiant visionaries.
It's like discovering an oasis when you're lost in the desert. It's Bitcoin that's single-handedly responsible for the current wave of cypherpunk activity.
So these are 12 portraits that were made to honor 12 cypherpunks that obviously are sort of the forefathers of everything that we've been discussing, that we've been talking about. They are the forerunners of digital money. The entire idea of Bitcoin was a twinkle in their eye before Satoshi Nakamoto obviously invented it. So I'd like to, have the artists come to the stage. I guess they're already there, and they are going to present now the 3 portraits for Adam Back, Phil Zimmermann, and Stella Assange. Please come over. All right.
All right, thank you.
I think somebody's going to take some photos, I think. I'm not sure where the photographers are, but Adam Back, everybody. Give him a hand.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to get it in the overhead bin.
All right, Stella Assange. Julian, obviously, is not here with us, but this is his portrait. Okay, and of course, Phil Zimmermann, who is sitting here, and the piece of art there. All right, these are the activists that believe in privacy for everybody, for a world where we don't have to obey the dictates of government to have self-sovereignty over our digital lives. This is a tribute to them, to the forerunners, and that's what we're here to honor. Let's see, we are going to be showing these, I guess, outside in the hallway. But there's another thing that we are going to be doing this year, which is to start nominating for another generation of cypherpunk. So we have at least one on stage. Paolo is going to be part of the inaugural class of the new cypherpunks. Elizabeth Sark, who's been delayed by some planes and stuff like that. She'll be here tomorrow, but she'll be another one. But there's a URL that you can go to. I'm not sure if they're going to show it on the screen or whatever, but there's an opportunity for you to nominate some cypherpunks and to continue on this legacy of having, to promote personal freedom, to promote self-sovereignty, and so on. So yeah, let's give them a hand. Please go ahead and nominate your favorite second gen. Yeah, there's the URL. There you go. cpm23.com. Nominate. Please go ahead and nominate. And thank you very much. And yeah.